Here we have with us Mike Zackon. Mike Zackon grew up with the Oley Fair, and his father, Dr. Bernard Zackon, was the first president of the Oley Fair. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you very much. Tonight we're going to talk about some of the memories of the Oley Fair, particularly mine, and of course, obviously, we all have different ones. I was just expanding to the crew about how every night in the Oley Fair, the early Oley Fair days, they didn't have counting machines for the money. Nothing cost more than, I think, 50 cents. And so there was a plethora of coins. As a consequence, every night they had a crew, which sometimes changed. They went to my father's place, which was right next to the Widener Funeral Home in those days. And they'd sit in the kitchen around this big table, smoking cigars and counting coins. And if you didn't know, you'd swear you just walked into a gambling den with all the coins on the table. At the end of the night, and many of the people, Carl Blank, Johnny Frankhauser, Oscar Schaefer, Paul Henney, Jake Henney, I'm forgetting the secretary of the bank, because Russ Hawes, who lived right across, and there was others who would come and go. At the end of each night, after they counted, they put the coins in these big bags and drug them across the street to the bank. At 2 or 3 in the morning, they make the deposit into the bank, and Jake would lock up, Jake Henney, who was the president, and they'd start over the next day. Some of my other memories, I had somewhat an ardent interest in the horse shows, which was held every year, and that was held where basically I'm assuming the baseball field is at the current time. And it was a rather popular event. About 5 years into the horse show, they started having the Marine Corps show up with a howitzer, which it didn't fit the fair, but they would show up on a Saturday afternoon, and at like 6 o'clock, they'd fire off several rounds, which echoed out throughout the valley, which sounded neat as an echo. Horses don't like that. The horse show usually ended by around 5 in the afternoon. And they then, of course, are loading the horses and taking them home. The Marines either didn't get the message or there was a miscommunication of some sort, because they started firing the howitzers as the horses are still floating around the rink. They found one of the horses the next day at Yellow House Hotel. They found another horse the next day at Frank Fisher's farm. And they found 2 at Frank Fisher's farm. So there was 3. The rest of them they corralled in the Oley town area. Unfortunately, my father hadn't turned off the mic, and he had some interesting comments that were going out over the mic while this was going on. And the good news is, because of the howitzers, you couldn't hear what he was saying. I remember there was a fellow by the name of Uncle Pete Boyle. I don't know if anybody this is really going back. He had one of the early black and white television shows in Philadelphia. He lived in Pike Township, right around Pikeville. He had a home. So he'd come every Saturday at the horse show, and he'd stand right next to the judging stand, and he'd sketch. That's what he used to do. One of the things he used to do at on his television show. And of course, he used Western regalia was his motif. He would do whatever. If a young kid would come up to him and say, would you sketch that? He'd sketch it for in quick strokes. And he was a lot of fun. The irony of this is his son, also his name was Pete Boyle. He was one of the main actors in Frankenstein, the movie, and he was the father on Everybody Loves Raymond. That was his son. He didn't live with Peter, but he occasionally came with Peter to the fair. I remember seeing the Sputnik go over when I was early morning at the fair. My dad had to come up, I guess, to treat a couple cows, and at about 8 o'clock in the morning, which then was a big deal, because that was the first time this has ever happened, everybody stopped, walked outside the barn, and stood and watched for Sputnik, which did go across the sky as at an appointed time. What else do I remember about the fair? There's tons of stuff, but remember eating the hot dogs at the fair for a dime. Maybe 15 cents, but I don't know, inflation. But anyway, the other thing I do remember, the Angstadts had the John Deere tent, and I spent as much time as I could, because back then John Deere used to make all kinds of little replica toys of tractors and all the sundry pieces of equipment. I couldn't stay away from that stand. That just fascinated me. I also remember right across the street was the display of the automobile dealers, which I don't know if anyone's talked about. They'd show up, and everything was under. They had the new cars. That was the big deal. They were coming out. That's in September is when the cars came out, but they kept them under wraps so you couldn't see them. They were, and half the time as kids we would try and look under the salespeople would throw us out and move us on. But that was a big deal. I also remember Governor Leader coming to the fair and speaking. That's the year he was actually starting to run for president, and he came and spoke. In fact, he stood right in front of where the automobiles were displayed, which of course is a good spot because everybody was paying attention to the cars. I remember, which I'm sure everybody else talked about, I remember helping as a little kid taking down the tents and putting the tents up, and at my weight class in those days, I'm not sure I was much of a help, but it made me feel important. I have other memories, I'm sure, but is that?
If you have more, you can share more yet.
Well, let's see. Uncle Pete, kitchen. Oh, the ticket booths, the chicken coops. The chicken coops were the original ticket booths from day one. As far as no, they did have a tent, I think, initially, where you came to the tent, but then they got the chicken booths. And when they moved over across the street to the fire company grounds, initially the grounds were not processed. Everything was just dirt. And they'd put the chicken booths on the hills, the slopes, in front of the stands where you would buy your tickets for your food. Unfortunately, if it rained, it was literally like a flood, and the water would come gushing, and for hours, under the ticket booth. So you had to sit in there with your feet up against the front panel of the ticket booth. Otherwise, you were completely soaked from the ankles down. And that happened a number of years. We had a bad stretch. We had hurricanes constantly coming through the fair. And it was, that was fun too.
Were the ticket booths also used on the school side?
I can't remember. I do remember initially, I think they went to a tent.
Okay.
And it might be right like the food line, and you just went there and then you went down. Yeah, I think that's what they did, but I could be corrected. But they did soon thereafter get the ticket booths, and then that was the standard operating procedure. Yep. And it was tons of fun. I do have great memories. Oh, I remember when they used the high school for the exhibitions, any of the displays that the women were in charge of, they all wore period clothing, i.e. colonial clothing or Pennsylvania Dutch clothing. Like, you weren't basically allowed to come in there and work if you didn't have an outfit like that. And it was sort of interesting because, of course, we hit a point where that didn't work anymore. But that's how they initially started. So, a lot of good memories.